In this video, we will show you how to replace your front wheel bearings and front seal on this two-wheel drive Ford Ranger. This will be located inside of your front brake rotors. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. Safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Once you've done so, we're going to continue on to removing the center cover, the 19mm lug nuts, and the wheel. With the wheel out of the way, let's have a close look at the brakes. We do want to make sure that they are still in good reusable condition because the bearings are located inside of the rotor. If it looks like the brakes need to be replaced, now's the time to do it. Let's continue on to pushing in our two caliper pistons. On this particular caliper, it will have a piston along the bottom and the top. To push those back, we can easily use a pry bar. Carefully come in between these slots and pry up against the rotor. This should push back each one of those pistons just enough that we can continue on from there. Once you have those two pistons pushed back as far as you can, we'll continue on with our two caliper slider pin bolts. You'll be using a 13mm for each of these. We'll loosen up the top one first. Once we have that loose, we'll continue on with fully removing the bottom. That one's nice and loose. Inspect your mounting hardware as you remove it, replace as necessary. Once you have both of those bolts out of there, you should be able to take hold of the caliper, give it a wiggle, and remove it from the area. You could carefully use a pry bar. Once you have the caliper out of place, we'll be continuing on to paying attention to each of the two caliper pistons. You need to ensure that they're pushed back in fully and there's no leak. If you see any fluid coming along the seal, typically that means that there's an issue with the seal itself and you will have to replace the caliper. To push in your caliper pistons, you want to do them at the same time. With that said, we'll be using an old brake pad. Now we can continue on by pressing this in, and that'll press in both of those pistons. Let's use a caliper compression tool here. Make sure it's going the right way. There we are. Now we can set this aside, putting no pressure on our flex hose. Let's continue on to removing our brake pads from the area. Ours are frozen in the bracket. When you remove your brake pads, it's a good idea to give them a quick inspection. Make sure it doesn't look like they're worn at an angle. That could tell us we're having an issue with the caliper. This one looks fine. We'll set it aside. This one out of here. Let's remove our two caliper bracket bolts. There's one out in the open, and the other one's just behind the knuckle. Use a 15mm for these. We'll leave that bolt in there just a couple threads for now. Remove your caliper bracket and set it aside. In the center of the rotor, you're going to find that you have a small cover. We'll have to pop this out of place. You can do that using pliers or even a tool that looks like this. Now, once you pop that out of place, it's important to give it a close inspection. Make sure it's not damaged. You will be reusing this. Go ahead and clean it up and set it aside. Once you have that out of the way, let's continue on with some cutters. Typically, you will find that you have a locking cotter pin in this area. Go ahead and take that right out of there. It's a good idea to replace these. Now, once you have that out of the way, you should be able to remove this area. As you can tell, this has a whole bunch of slots making its way around. This is what holds the nut in place. There's a small hole that goes through the spindle that goes straight up and down for that locking cotter pin. You want to make sure this is still in good reusable condition. Now we can start removing our 1 1/16 nut. You can use a wrench or some pliers for this. Now once you start loosening this, you do want to pay attention to the fact that the rotor will come loose at this point. Make sure you're holding onto the rotor so it does not potentially fall off and hurt you once you have removed that mounting nut and washer. At this point, there should be a washer located just behind the nut. And then inside the front of the rotor, that's where you're going to find the outside wheel bearing. That's the smaller of the two. At this point, we'll carefully slide the brake rotor out of place, and we can have a look along the backside. Let's bring this over to the bench so we can remove the seal and the bearing from the backside. Now with this on the bench, we're going to start removing the seal from this area. You could use a pry bar and carefully make your way down under here at an angle and gently pry it up using leverage. Otherwise, you could just use a seal remover tool. Not everybody has one of these. Like I said, you could just use a pry bar. As we start pulling this out, we want to be careful not to get hurt. We'll just gently pry it up and out of place. There's the original seal. We can set this aside to dispose of it. Let's get this inner bearing out of there. And there it is, friend. Looking at our rotor, you can tell that we are going to replace this. If yours was in good condition, the next thing that you need to do before you install the bearings would be to make your way inside this area. Go ahead and give it a good cleaning, a thorough inspection, and then you would continue on with installing your lubricated bearings. Make sure you get the back side here and also get the front as well. Get this one. Double check to make sure you don't see any scoring on the races. At this point, it's time to pack the wheel bearings. You want to make sure that you have grease inside of the center areas on each one of the bearings themselves. Now looking at each of these, you can tell they have a whole bunch of little roller bearings that make their way all the way across, and you can see that groove. It's a little difficult to pack grease inside there. Typically, if you were to put grease on the gloved palm of your hand, you could take the bearing and gently start forcing it in, just like this. Just roll it right in. Otherwise, we'll be continuing on with a bearing packing tool. Take each one of the bearings and try to center it as close as possible. I'm going to start with the inboard one, which is the larger of the two, and then the outboard one, which is the smaller. Once you have that in place, we can continue on with the driver. This will press right down up against that area of the bearing. Once we press this down, the grease will start making its way up in between all of these areas. I'm just going to turn this in here, bring it down. There we are. Make sure this is pressed in. Now, as you can see, looking inside through the clear plastic, I can see grease made its way up and through that bearing. We'll just confirm that real quick by pulling this out of place. Remove as much of this extra grease as possible. We don't really need too much. Wow. Looking inside there, I can tell that both of these bearings are completely packed the way that they need to be. That's perfect. We've got our new rotor here. Looking along the back of the rotor, I'm going to take my gloved finger with some grease on it and lubricate each of these areas. We have the race, right where the inner bearing's going to go, and then you have the outer bearing deep on the inside there. That one's a little bit hard to gain access to from this side, but that's okay. We'll pause there and continue on with that inner bearing. Go ahead and take this and put it in place. Once you have that in place, continue on to removing the excess grease. Here's where we're going to continue on with our seal. Go ahead and take that seal and put it in place up against the brake rotor. We're trying to align it as close as possible. Continue on with a steel driver, pressing it down as flat as possible until it's completely bottomed out against the brake rotor. We'll just double check all the way around this. Assuming you're completely seated all the way around, continue on to turning the brake rotor over. At this point, with the glove finger, we'll add some lubricant in the forward port here, right along that race where your bearing's going to go. Now that we have this lubricated, let's pause on the brake rotor itself and make our way back over to the vehicle. Now on the vehicle itself, we'll be paying attention to the stud that comes out of here. Just use a rag, go ahead and give this a quick wipe. We want to ensure that it is still in good working order. It's not rotted or damaged in any way. Once you've cleaned this portion, it's important to make your way all the way up into this area. This is where the seal will sit. You want to ensure that it's clean and free of any debris and it's not grooved in any way that moisture might make its way into where the bearings are and potentially cause serious damage. Wipe down that mounting hardware here. You have the nut, the washer, and you should also have the locking castle washer. Just make sure these are still in good working order. Yeah. At this point, we can continue on to installing the brake rotor. When doing so, we'll have a look along the back side. Take a little bit of that grease and we'll just lubricate along the seal. Continue on to sliding this into place. As you bring this into position, make sure that you hold on to the brake rotor at all times so it does not potentially fall off and hurt you or get damaged. We'll take some more grease and pack it directly into the hole here. It's always good to have a little extra. That way there, once it heats up, it can work its way into the bearing. Careful for any pinch points. There we are. Continue on to your bearing. Next thing after that will be the washer and then the nut. At this point, I'm going to bottom it out by hand. We'll continue on by cleaning this up a little bit, and then we can make our wheel bearing adjustment. Now to make this adjustment, we'll be using our 1 1/16 wrench. We're going to have to take hold of the rotor, and we'll be spinning it at the same time as we attempt to snug the nut. Now when I'm doing this, you can tell that I'm not putting very much pressure on this, but every time that I did spin it and attempt to bottom it out, the wrench continued moving further and further clockwise, continuing to tighten. We don't want to over tighten this and cause damage to the bearings, but you do need to ensure that there is not any movement. At this point, I'll take hold of the rotor, try to give it a little wiggle. We're feeling for any movement. Assuming that's good, let's continue on to the locking clip and cotter pin. Once you feel as though you have the slots aligned, we'll get that cotter pin in there. Pin it in so you're sure there is no way this axle nut can loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Now it's time for our protective cover. Now once again, we do need to make sure we have a good seal, so we want to ensure that nothing can make its way into this area and cause contamination. Use some gasket maker to prevent anything making its way in. Now we can tap this into place. Before you continue putting the brakes together, it's important to make sure you clean and inspect the mounting bracket. Carefully take that bracket and slide it over the brake rotor. Once you have that aligned, we'll take our 2 mounting bolts, start them in position, snug them up, and torque them to 85 foot-pounds. The next thing we'll do is continue on to our brake pads. We'll take each of these and slide them into position. If it feels as though they don't slide in easily, you may have to continue cleaning your bracket. Double check to make sure they can move around freely, and then you can continue on with your caliper. Before you reinstall the caliper, the next thing you'll want to do is apply some high temperature lubricant to each one of your caliper pistons and the backside of each of the 3 ears. Doing this will help with vibration dampening and noise reduction overall. Now we can take the caliper and put it in place, being careful not to twist our flex hose. Let's continue on with our 2 caliper slider bolts. Start them in, snug them up, torque them to 27 foot-pounds. We'll just double check that flex hose before we move away from this point. Before we continue on to reinstalling the wheel, let's just have one last look at everything. You want to confirm that you do have this sealed, the flex hose is not twisted, and everything's back together torqued as it should be. Let's take that wheel and put it in position. Start on all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts, we'll bottom them out, get the wheel safely back on the ground, and we can torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Now that we have this on the ground, we'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. If you had a center cover, go ahead and install that now. Looking along the backside, you're going to find the area for each one of your lug nuts to fit into. Go ahead and align that and tap it into place. Okay friends, we've got our vehicle together. At this point, the process for one side of the vehicle is the exact same thing as the other. After you've completed that, go ahead into the passenger compartment, pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm. Take your vehicle for a road test, listen for funny noises. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.